Music notation or musical notation is any system used to visually represent orally perceived music through the use of written symbols, including ancient or modern musical symbols. Types and methods of notation have varied between cultures and throughout history, and much information about ancient music notation is fragmentary. Although many ancient cultures used symbols to represent melodies, none of them is nearly as comprehensive as written language, limiting our modern understanding. Comprehensive music notation began to be developed in Europe in the Middle Ages, and has been adapted to many kinds of music worldwide. History. Ancient Near East. The earliest form of musical notation can be found in a cuneiform tablet that was created at Nippur, in Sumer, in about 2000 BC. The tablet represents fragmentary instructions for performing music, that the music was composed in harmonies or thirds, and that it was written using a diatonic scale. A tablet from about 1250 BC shows a more developed form of notation. Although the interpretation of the notation system is still controversial, it is clear that the notation indicates the names of strings on a lyre, the tuning of which is described in other tablets. Although they are fragmentary, these tablets represent the earliest notated melodies found anywhere in the world. Ancient Greece. Ancient Greek musical notation was in use from at least the 6th century BC until approximately the 4th century AD. Several complete compositions and fragments of compositions using this notation survive. The notation consists of symbols placed above text syllables. An example of a complete composition is the Seikilos epitaph, which has been variously dated between the 2nd century BC to the 1st century AD. 3 hymns by Mesomedes of Crete exist in manuscript. The Delphic hymns, dated to the 2nd century BC, also use this notation, but they are not completely preserved. Ancient Greek notation appears to have fallen out of use around the time of the decline of the Roman Empire. Byzantine Empire. Byzantine music has mainly survived as music for court ceremonies, including vocal religious music. The question, whether it is based on the monodic modal singing and instrumental music of ancient Greece, must remain open. Greek theoretical categories played a key role to understand and transmit Byzantine music. Especially the tradition of Damascus had a strong impact on the pre-Islamic Near East, comparable to Persian music in its music theoretical transfer. In Sanskrit, unlike Western notation, Byzantine noims always indicate modal steps in relation to a clef or modal key. Originally this key or the incipit of a common melody was enough to indicate a certain melodic model given within the echoes. Despite ekphonetic notation, further early melodic notation developed not earlier than between the 9th and the 10th century. Like the Greek alphabet, notational signs are ordered left to right. The question of rhythm was entirely based on chironomia, well-known melodical phrases given by gestures of the choir leaders which existed once as part of an oral tradition. Today the main difference between Western and Eastern noims is that Eastern notation symbols are differential rather than absolute, i.e., they indicate pitch steps, and the musicians know to deduce correctly, from the score and the note they are singing presently, which correct interval is meant. These step symbols themselves, or better, phonic noims, resemble brush strokes and are colloquially called gantizoi in modern Greek. Notes as pitch classes or modal keys are represented in written form only between these noims. In modern notation they simply serve as an optional reminder, and modal and tempo directions have been added, if necessary. In Papadic notation, medial signatures usually meant a temporary change into another echoes. The so-called great signs were once related to chironomic signs. According to modern interpretations, they are understood as embellishments and microtonal attractions, both essential in Byzantine chant. Since Chrysanthos of Maditos, there are 7 standard note names used for solfege: pa, vu, gha, dhe, k, acute, zo, ni, while the older practice still used the 4 enochimeter or intonation formulas of the 4 echoi given by the modal signatures, the authentic or kyrioi in ascending direction, and the plagal or plagiaroi in descending direction. With exception of vu and zo, they do roughly correspond to Western solmization syllables as re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. Byzantine music uses the 8 natural, non-tempered scales whose elements were identified by koi sounds exclusively, and therefore the absolute pitch of each note may slightly vary each time, depending on the particular kos used. Byzantine notation is still used in many Orthodox churches. Sometimes cantors also use transcriptions into Western or Kievan staff notation while adding non-notatable embellishment material from memory and sliding into the natural scales from experience. But even concerning modern Noam editions since the reform of Chrysanthos, a lot of details are only known from an oral tradition related to traditional masters and their experience. 13th century Near East. In 1252, Safi al-Din al-Umayyad developed a form of musical notation, where rhythms were represented by geometric representation. Many subsequent scholars of rhythm have sought to develop graphical geometrical notations. For example, a similar geometric system was published in 1987 by K. L. Gustafsson, whose method represents a rhythm as a two-dimensional graph. Early Europe scholar and music theorist Isidore of Seville, writing in the early 7th century, considered that, unless sounds are held by the memory of man, they perish, because they cannot be written down. By the middle of the 9th century, however, a form of pneumatic notation began to develop in monasteries in Europe as a mnemonic device for Gregorian chant, using symbols known as noims. The earliest surviving musical notation of this type is in the Musica Disciplina of Aurelian of Aria Ome, from about 850. There are scattered survivals from the Iberian Peninsula before this time, of a type of notation known as Visigothic noims, but its few surviving fragments have not yet been deciphered. The problem with this notation was that it only showed melodic contours, and consequently the music could not be read by someone who did not know the music already. Notation had developed far enough to notate melody, but there was still no system for notating rhythm. A mid-13th century treatise, De Mensurabilia Musica, explains a set of 6 rhythmic modes that were in use at the time, although it is not clear how they were formed. These rhythmic modes were all in triple time and rather limited rhythm in chant to 6 different repeating patterns. This was a flaw seen by German music theorist Franco of Cologne and summarized as part of his treatise Ars Cantus Mensurabilis. He suggested that individual notes could have their own rhythms represented by the shape of the note. Not until the 14th century did something like the present system of fixed note lengths arise. The use of regular measures became commonplace by the end of the 17th century. The founder of what is now considered the standard music stave was Guido di Arezzo, an Italian Benedictine monk who lived from about 991 until after 1033. He taught the use of solmization syllables based on a hymn to Saint John the Baptist, which begins at Quint Laxus and was written by the Lombard historian Paul the Deacon. The first stanza is, Ut Quint Laxus, Resonare Fibris, Myra Gestorum, Family Tuorum, Solve Polluta, Labii Reatum, Sancta Iohannis. Guido used the first syllable of each line, ut, re, mi, fa, sol, and la, to read notated music in terms of hexachords. They were not note names, and each could, depending on context, be applied to any note. In the 17th century, ut was changed in most countries except France to the easily singable, open, syllable do, said to have been taken from the name of the Italian theorist Giovanni Battista Doni. Modern staff notation Modern music notation originated in European classical music and is now used by musicians of many different genres throughout the world. The system uses a 5-line staff. Pitch is shown by placement of notes on the staff, and duration is shown with different note values and additional symbols such as dots and ties. Notation is read from left to right, which makes setting music for right-to-left scripts difficult. A staff of written music generally begins with a clef, which indicates the position of one particular note on the staff. The treble or G clef was originally a letter G, and it identifies the second line up on the 5-line staff as the note G above middle C. The bass or F clef shows the position of the note F below middle C. Notes representing a pitch outside of the scope of the 5-line staff can be represented using ledger lines, which provide a single note with additional lines and spaces. Following the clef, the key signature on a staff indicates the key of the piece by specifying that certain notes are flat or sharp throughout the piece, unless otherwise indicated. Following the key signature is the time signature. Measures divide the piece into groups of beats, and the time signatures specify those groupings. Directions to the player regarding matters such as tempo, dynamics and expression appear above or below the staff. For vocal music, lyrics are written. For short pauses, retakes are added. In music for ensembles, a score shows music for all players together, while parts contain only the music played by an individual musician. A score can be constructed from a complete set of parts and vice versa. The process can be laborious, but computer software offers a more convenient and flexible method. Specialized notation conventions. Percussion notation conventions are varied because of the wide range of percussion instruments. Percussion instruments are generally grouped into two categories: pitched and non-pitched. The notation of non-pitched percussion instruments is the more problematic and less standardized. Figured bass notation originated in Baroque basso continuo parts. It is also used extensively in accordion notation. The bass notes of the music are conventionally notated, along with numbers and other signs that determine the chords to play. It does not, however, specify the exact pitches of the harmony, leaving that for the performer to improvise. A lead sheet specifies only the melody, lyrics and harmony, using one staff with chord symbols placed above and lyrics below. It is used to capture the essential elements of a popular song without specifying how the song should be arranged or performed. A chord chart or chart contains little or no melodic information at all, but provides detailed harmonic and rhythmic information. Using slash notation and rhythmic notation. This is the most common kind of written music used by professional session musicians playing jazz or other forms of popular music, and is intended primarily for the rhythm section. Simpler chord charts for songs may contain only the chord changes placed above the lyrics where they occur. Such charts depend on prior knowledge of the melody, and are used as reminders in performance or informal group singing. The Shapenote system is found in some church hymnals, sheet music, and song books, especially in the southern United States. Instead of the customary elliptical notehead, noteheads of various shapes are used to show the position of the note on the major scale. Sacred Harp is one of the most popular tune books using shape notes. Notation in various countries. India. The Indian scholar and musical theorist Pingala, in his Chanda Sutra, used marks indicating long and short syllables to indicate meters in Sanskrit poetry. In the notation of Indian raga, a solfege-like system called sargam is used. As in Western solfege, there are names for the 7 basic pitches of a major scale. The tonic of any scale is named sa, and the dominant pa. Sa is fixed in any scale, and pa is fixed at a fifth above it. These two notes are known as akale swa. Each of the other 5 notes, re, gad, ma, dha and ni, can take a regular pitch, which is equivalent to its pitch in a standard major scale, or an altered pitch, either a half step above or half step below the shuddha pitch. re, ga, dha, and ni all have altered partners that are a half step lower. Ma has an altered partner that is a half step higher. Re, ga, ma, dha, and ni are called Vikrut swar. In the written system of Indian notation devised by Ravi Shankar, the pitches are represented by Western letters. Capital letters are used for the Akale swar, and for the higher variety of all the Vikrut swar. Lowercase letters are used for the lower variety of the Vikrut swar. Other systems exist for non-12-tone equal temperament and non-Western music, such as the Indian Swaralipi. Russia and Byzantium and Russia, sacred music was notated with special hooks and banners. China. The earliest known examples of text referring to music in China are inscriptions on musical instruments found in the tomb of Marquis Yi of Zheng. Sets of 41 chime stones and 65 bells bore lengthy inscriptions concerning pitches, scales, and transposition. The bells still sound the pitches that the inscriptions refer to. Although no notated musical compositions were found, the inscriptions indicate that the system was sufficiently advanced to allow for musical notation. Two systems of pitch nomenclature existed, one for relative pitch and one for absolute pitch. For relative pitch, a solmization system was used. Gongcha notation used Chinese characters for the names of the scale. Korea Jenganbo is traditional Korean musical notation system introduced by Sejong the Great and known as the first musical notation system that is able to represent durations of notes in the Eastern. Among various kinds of Korean traditional music, Jenganbo targets a particular genre, Jengak. Japanese music is highly diversified, and therefore requires various systems of notation. In Japanese shakuhachi music, for example, glissandos and timbres are often more significant than distinct pitches, whereas taiko notation focuses on discrete strokes. Indonesian notation plays a relatively minor role in the oral traditions of Indonesia. However, in Java and Bali, several systems were devised beginning at the end of the 19th century, initially for archival purposes. Today the most widespread are cipher notations in which the pitches are represented with some subset of the numbers chapter 1 to 7, with one corresponding to either highest note of a particular octave, as in Sundanese gamelan, or lowest, as in the Kepasihan notation of Javanese gamelan. Notes in the ranges outside the central octave are represented with one or more dots above or below each number. For the most part, these cipher notations are mainly used to notate the skeletal melody and vocal parts, although transcriptions of the elaborating instrument variations are sometimes used for analysis and teaching. Drum parts are notated with a system of symbols largely based on letters representing the vocables used to learn and remember drumming patterns. These symbols are typically laid out in a grid underneath the skeletal melody for a specific or generic piece. The symbols used for drum notation are highly variable from place to place and performer to performer. In addition to these current systems, two older notations used a kind of staff. The Solanese script could capture the flexible rhythms of the Pasanden with a squiggle on a horizontal staff, while in Yogyakarta a ladder-like vertical staff allowed notation of the balungan by dots and also included important drum strokes. In Bali, there are a few books published of gamelan gender wayang pieces, employing alphabetical notation in the Old Balinese script. Composers and scholars both Indonesian and foreign have also mapped the Slendro and Pelog tuning systems of gamelan onto the Western staff, with and without various symbols for microtones. The Dutch composer Tunde Leeuw also invented a three-line staff for his composition gending. However, these systems do not enjoy widespread use. In the second half of the 20th century, Indonesian musicians and scholars extended cipher notation to other oral traditions, and a diatonic scale cipher notation has become common for notating Western-related genres. Unlike the cipher notation for gamelan music, which uses a fixed do, Indonesian diatonic cipher notation is movable do notation. so scores must indicate which pitch corresponds to the number 1. A short melody in slendro notated using the suricata method. The same notated using the Yogyakarta method or checkered notation. The same notated using Shapenote notation. The same approximated using Western notation. Play.